Part 1. The rain wasn't a gentle fall. It was a heavy, angry downpour that turned the city's evening lights into blurry smears of color. It hissed against the asphalt and drummed on the roof of Patrol Car 47. Inside, Officer Rick Dalton took a slow sip of lukewarm coffee from a stained thermos. His shift had another 3 hours to go, and the bad weather meant two things: less honest people out on the roads, and the ones who were out were often in a hurry, making mistakes. Dalton had been on the job for 15 years. In the early days, he'd loved it. The structure, the uniform, the clear sense of right and wrong. But over time, the job had worn him down like a river stone. He'd seen too much: the lies, the violence, the endless cycle of the same faces, causing the same problems. His outlook had hardened. He saw the city as two separate worlds, divided by the glass of his patrol car window. Out there were the civilians, the ones who didn't get it, who broke the rules and then cried about the consequences. And in here, in the car, was him, the one who had to clean up the mess. His partner, a younger officer named Louise, who still had some of that early days shine, was talking about a basketball game. Dalton grunted in response, his eyes scanning the wet streets. He wasn't really listening. He was thinking about the stack of paperwork waiting for him back at the precinct, and the stupid argument he'd had with his wife that morning about money. The world felt tilted against him. That's when he saw it. A flash of electric blue, a low-slung sports car that cost more than his yearly salary. It blew through the red light at the intersection of 7th and Main, like the signal was just a suggestion. Dalton didn't hesitate. His instincts kicked in, a mix of duty and a sharp personal irritation. "Got one," he said, cutting off Luce's sentence. He hit the lights and sirens. The blue and red reflections danced across the slick, black street. The sports car pulled over smoothly under the awning of a closed bank, its tail lights glowing like angry eyes in the rain. Dalton radioed in the stop, his voice flat and professional. 7 Adam 47, traffic stop, 7th and Main. Blue foreign vehicle. 1 occupant. He told Lise to stay put as cover, a standard procedure. He didn't need backup for a traffic stop, but you never knew. He adjusted his duty belt, his hand brushing against the grip of his Glock, a familiar and heavy presence. He took a deep breath, his face settling into the stern, neutral mask he wore for the public, and stepped out into the rain. The cold water immediately soaked into his shoulders. He approached the driver's side, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom and illuminating the interior. The driver was a young woman. He could see expensive-looking blonde hair, a sharp jawline. She was already looking in her mirror, her movements quick and nervous. He reached the window. It slid down with a quiet electric hum, and a puff of warm, perfumed air hit his cold face. "License and registration, ma'am," he said, his voice leaving no room for anything but compliance. The woman, maybe in her early 20s, nodded. Her eyes were wide. "Yes, officer. Sorry about that. The light, it was yellow, I thought." "License and registration, please," Dalton repeated, cutting her off. He hated the excuses first thing. Always an excuse. She fumbled with a slim leather purse. Her hands, adorned with simple but elegant rings, were shaking. She pulled out a plastic card holder and extracted a license. "The registration is in the glove box," she said, her voice tight. "Go ahead and get it," Dalton said. He shined his light past her, a quick sweep of the passenger seat. Empty, a coffee cup in the holder. A phone on the dash. The woman turned her body slightly to reach across to the glove compartment. It was a perfectly normal movement. But in Dalton's mind, conditioned by 1,000 training scenarios and 1,000 bad memories, a switch flipped. The interior of the car was dark. She was leaning away from him, her right side hidden. His flashlight beam couldn't follow her hands. The rain was loud, pounding on his hat. All he could see was a privileged kid in a fancy car, nervous, making a sudden move away from him. The stack of complaints from his last review, overly aggressive, quick to escalate, flashed in his mind, stoking a defensive anger. These people, he thought, they think the rules don't apply. They think their money or their last name lets them do whatever they want. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded his system. The argument with his wife, the disrespect he felt every day, the deep-seated belief that this woman in her perfect car represented everything that looked down on him, it all crystallized in that single, chaotic moment. Don't move. He barked, his voice a harsh crack that cut through the rain's noise. The woman froze, mid-reach, and started to turn her head back toward him, confusion on her face. But Dalton was already in motion. His training took over, but it was twisted by bias, by a story he'd already written in his head. In one fluid, terrifying motion, he unholstered his service weapon. He brought it up, two-handed, and pointed it directly at the driver's side window. The dark muzzle of the pistol was less than 3 feet from the young woman's face, separated only by a pane of glass. Time stopped. Inside the car, the world dissolved into pure animal terror. The young woman, whose name was Amelia Vance, saw the weapon, the officer's grim face behind it, his eyes narrowed. Her breath caught in her throat. Every thought emptied from her head, except one. I am going to die. Her hands flew up instinctively, palms open, high in the air. A small, choked sound escaped her lips. In the patrol car, Lise sat bolt upright. Rick, what are you doing? He whispered to the empty air, his stomach turning to ice. He saw his partner's stance, the weapon drawn. This was all wrong for a simple traffic stop. The rain poured down. For 90 long seconds, Officer Rick Dalton held his gun on Amelia Vance. He shouted commands. Keep your hands where I can see them. Do not move. His heart hammered against his ribs. He was completely focused on the threat he believed was in the car, blind to the reality. Amelia, trembling violently, managed to stammer, It's just my registration. Please. My dad is Mayor Vance. Please. The words filtered through Dalton's adrenaline haze. Mayor Vance. The name landed like a physical blow. The city's mayor. His boss's boss's boss. For the first time, he really looked at the decal on the windshield he'd vaguely registered earlier. It was a small, official city seal. Mayoral security pass. The fight-or-flight energy drained from him so fast it left him dizzy. The heavy weight of the gun in his hand suddenly felt alien, wrong. A cold dread, far deeper than the rain, seeped into his bones. He slowly lowered the weapon. He reholstered it, his movements stiff. Step out of the car, he said, his voice now hollow. All the aggression gone, replaced by a shaky formality. Amelia, sobbing quietly, her body trembling with shock, fumbled with the door handle and stepped out into the rain. She was soaked in seconds, her arms still half raised. Dalton didn't handcuff her. He just stood there, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, as Lise ran up with an umbrella. The younger officer looked from his partner's pale face to the terrified young woman. His own expression, a mix of horror and confusion. The traffic stop ended not with a ticket, but with mumbled, awkward apologies from Dalton and a promise from Lise to drive Amelia home in her own car. Dalton sat alone in the patrol car, the heater blasting, watching his partner's taillights disappear into the rain. His hands were steady on the wheel, but inside he was reeling. He had crossed the line, and he knew it. He thought about the dash camera mounted on the windshield, recording every second, every word. A deep, sickening certainty settled in his gut. His career, his life, had just changed forever. And it had all started with a red light, a rainy night, and a story he had convinced himself was true before he even knew the facts. The sleek, blue car pulled into the driveway of the large, traditional brick house in the quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. Officer Luis was at the wheel, his face tight with a discomfort he couldn't shake. In the passenger seat, Amelia Vance sat perfectly still, wrapped in a standard-issue police blanket that smelled of stale coffee and sweat. She hadn't spoken a word the entire 10-minute drive. She just stared out the window at the blur of rainy streets, her mind playing the scene over and over on a terrifying loop. The flash of the muzzle, the officer's eyes, the feeling of the cold window against her forehead as she pressed back, trying to disappear. Luis put the car in park. "Ma'am, we're here," he said softly, his voice feeling too loud in the quiet cabin. Amelia didn't move for a second. Then, as if snapping back into her body, she fumbled for the door handle, dropped the blanket on the seat, and got out. She didn't thank him. She just walked, stiff-legged, up the path to her front door, the rain soaking her once more. Lees watched her go, a heavy stone of guilt in his stomach. He should have done something, said something. He replayed his partner's actions, the sudden, violent escalation. It wasn't right. None of it was right. He drove back to the precinct in silence, dreading the conversation to come. Inside the house, the warmth felt alien to Amelia. Her mother was in the kitchen, drying a wine glass. "You're soaked, honey. Did you have car trouble?" She called out, her voice cheerful. Amelia stood in the grand foyer, water pooling at her feet on the polished hardwood. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The words were trapped behind the wall of shock. Her legs gave way, and she slid down the wall into a crouch, a quiet, shuddering cry finally breaking free. Her mother was at her side in an instant, the glass forgotten. "Amelia? My God, what happened? Are you hurt?" Between ragged breaths, the story tumbled out in broken pieces. The light, the stop, the gun. Her father, Mayor Robert Vance, emerged from his home office, his reading glasses perched on his head. He listened, his face shifting from confusion to concern, and then to a cold, hard anger that his daughter had never seen before. It wasn't the loud, blustering anger of politics. This was quiet, deep, and dangerous. He knelt beside her, putting a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Did he hurt you? Physically?" She shook her head, her teeth chattering. "No, he pointed it at my face. For so long." The mayor stood up. His mind was already moving, shifting from father to public official. He knew better than anyone how these things could be buried, spun, or lost in procedure. "We need to report this properly, right now." He looked at his wife. "Call Attorney Reynolds. Tell him to meet us at the Central Precinct in an hour." Asterisk, 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 back at the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officer Dalton had returned alone, filled out the barest minimum of a stop report, and retreated to the locker room. He changed out of his wet uniform, his hands trembling now that the adrenaline was gone. He avoided eye contact with everyone. The story, however, had arrived before him. Lees had gone straight to their sergeant, a weary-looking man named O'Malley with 28 years on the job. Sergeant O'Malley listened, pinching the bridge of his nose. "He drew down on her? During a traffic stop? You're sure, Luis?" "I saw it, Sarge, clear as day. It was bad." O'Malley sighed, a heavy sound that carried the weight of too many similar conversations. He liked Dalton in a way. He was a hard worker, never shirked a call, but he'd seen the complaints pile up. He'd had the talks with him about his attitude, about de-escalation. They never seemed to stick. He summoned Dalton to his office. The door clicked shut, muffling the buzz of the shift change outside. Rick, talk to me. What happened on 7th and Main? Dalton stood stiffly, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall behind O'Malley. Driver ran a red. I initiated a stop. She made a furtive movement toward the glove box. I perceived a threat and reacted to protect myself. Furtive movement, O'Malley repeated, his voice flat. You pulled your gun. On the mayor's daughter, Rick. Dalton's jaw tightened. I didn't know who she was until after. That's not relevant to the threat. It's going to be very relevant, O'Malley said quietly. The dash cam. It was running? A muscle twitched in Dalton's cheek. He gave a single short nod. Go home, O'Malley said, his voice tired. You're on administrative leave, effective immediately. Do not contact anyone involved. Do not talk to the press. Internal Affairs will be in touch. The words administrative leave hit Dalton like a physical blow. It was the first step on a well-known path. He left the office, feeling the stares of his fellow officers boring into his back. The familiar world of the precinct, the only world he felt he truly belonged to anymore, had suddenly turned cold and hostile. He was in his personal truck, sitting in the parking lot in the dark when his phone buzzed. It was a text from a buddy in the patrol division. Asterisk heard what happened. The mayor just walked into the building with his daughter and 2 suits. Looks like lawyers. Chief is here too. Heads are gonna roll, man. Asterisk Dalton threw his phone onto the passenger seat. He rested his forehead on the steering wheel. A sickening thought, clearer than any before, came to him. This wasn't going to be smoothed over. This was going to be a fight. Asterisk, 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 at that very moment. Mayor Vance, his daughter, and their attorney were in the police chief's office. The chief, a political appointee who had worked closely with the mayor for years, was in an impossible position. He watched the dash cam footage on his laptop, his face growing pale. The video was silent, but brutally clear. The stop, the conversation. Amelia's nervous turn. Dalton's sudden, aggressive draw. The long, agonizing hold. Amelia's terrified face, her hands flying up. It lasted a minute and a half, but it felt like an eternity. When the screen went dark, the room was silent. Amelia looked at the floor, fresh tears welling up. Her father's voice was like ice. Well, Chief? The chief cleared his throat. Robert, Mayor Vance, this is completely unacceptable. On behalf of the department, I offer my deepest— Save it, the mayor cut him off. I don't want apologies. I want action. A full, transparent, by-the-book investigation. I want Internal Affairs to see this video. I want every complaint ever filed against this officer pulled and reviewed. And I want criminal charges considered. Is that understood? The chief nodded, knowing he had no choice. Understood. It will be done. The story, of course, did not stay in the room. By the next morning, it was the lead story on the local news. Mayor's daughter in terrifying traffic stop, the Chiron read. The police department, under pressure, released a short, vague statement confirming an officer was on leave, pending an investigation. They did not release the video, but the vacuum of information was filled by speculation and outrage. The city divided, quickly and predictably. On talk radio and social media, one side rallied behind Dalton. He was doing his job. They said, "It's a dangerous world. She should have listened faster." They painted Amelia as a spoiled kid who didn't respect authority. The other side, particularly voices from communities of color who had long protested aggressive policing, saw something else entirely. Community leaders held press conferences. For years, we have been telling you about officers like this, one pastor said, her voice trembling with emotion. We have filed complaints about intimidation, about guns drawn on our children for no reason. We were ignored. Now, because the victim is white and her father has power, suddenly it's a scandal. Suddenly there's an investigation. This proves what we've always known. The system only works for the privileged. Reporters digging for dirt on Dalton found it. They filed public records requests and found a list of over a dozen formal complaints over the past decade. Most were closed as unsubstantiated or resolved with training. The allegations were all similar: overly aggressive conduct, verbal abuse, unnecessary escalation during stops. All the complainants were from minority neighborhoods. One man, a mechanic, gave an emotional interview about Dalton, pointing a gun at him during a dispute over a parking spot. "He made me lie on the ground in front of my family," the man said. "I was just trying to get to work." Dalton, holed up in his house with the blinds drawn, watched the news coverage with a growing sense of betrayal. They were making him out to be a monster. They didn't understand the pressure, the constant danger. They didn't talk about the good stops, the drugs he'd taken off the street, the times he'd helped people. They were digging up old, baseless complaints to destroy him. He felt the world he knew collapsing, and he blamed everyone but himself. Amelia, meanwhile, tried to hide. Her friends texted her, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. She felt exposed, violated, and now strangely guilty. Seeing the news, hearing the stories of others, she realized with a dawning horror that her nightmare was an everyday fear for many people in her city. Her privilege had been a shield, and that night it had cracked, giving her a terrifying glimpse of what lay behind it. She wasn't just a victim of one officer's bad night. She was an accidental witness to a broken system, and she had no idea what to do with that knowledge. The city held its breath for the trial. It wasn't just a court case anymore. It was a public reckoning. On the morning jury selection began, a crowd gathered outside the courthouse. There were police union members with blue ribbons pinned to their jackets, holding signs that read, "Support our blue," and "A bad decision isn't a crime." Across the barricaded divide, community activists and residents held their own signs. "Accountability now," and "What if she didn't have a famous name?" Inside, the air was cool and carried the smell of old wood and floor polish. Officer Rick Dalton sat at the defense table, wearing a suit that felt like a costume. He looked older, thinner. The confident swagger of the patrol car was gone, replaced by a stiff, wary posture. His lawyer, a sharp-faced man known for defending cops, placed a reassuring hand on a file folder. At the prosecutor's table, a serious-faced woman organized her notes. She had been chosen for this case specifically, known for being thorough and tough. She glanced at Amelia Vance and her family, who sat in the front row of the public gallery. Amelia wore a simple, dark dress. She kept her eyes on her hands, folded in her lap. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The process began. The prosecution's case was built like a brick wall, one piece at a time. They started with the dry, technical facts. A traffic engineer confirmed the light was red for a full 2 seconds before the blue car entered the intersection. Then they called the evidence technician who presented the dash cam video. The judge ordered the monitors in the courtroom to be turned toward the jury. "The video contains no graphic violence," he instructed, "but the content is disturbing." For the second time in public, the silent movie played. The rain, the stop, the conversation, the sudden, shocking draw of the gun, the long, terrible 90 seconds. The jurors leaned forward. One woman's hand went to her mouth. A man winced and looked away for a moment before forcing his eyes back to the screen. Dalton did not watch. He stared straight ahead, his jaw a hard line. The prosecutor stood up. "You've seen the defendant's actions. Now let's talk about his state of mind." She began to call witnesses from Dalton's past. The mechanic he'd forced to the ground over a parking spot took the stand, his voice still shaking with anger years later. A young man described being pulled over and screamed at for a broken taillight, saying Dalton had kept his hand on his gun the entire time, making him feel like prey. A mother testified about Dalton roughly handcuffing her teenage son for jaywalking near their home. The pattern was clear, and the prosecutor painted it boldly. This was not a one-time mistake. This was who Officer Dalton was when he put on the badge. A man who saw threats where there were none, who led with aggression, especially in certain neighborhoods. Dalton's lawyer fought back hard. He attacked the credibility of the witnesses, pointing out minor inconsistencies in their old stories. He argued their complaints had been investigated and dismissed. "This is a smear campaign," he told the jury. "A tragedy of hindsight. You are being asked to judge a split-second decision in the comfort of this quiet room, not in a dark, rainy street where an officer's life can end in a blink." He put experts on the stand who talked about police training and the kill-or-be-killed mindset that is drilled into officers. They described the glove box as a classic hiding place for weapons. They argued that Amelia's movement, while innocent, fit the profile of a dangerous action. Officer Dalton didn't see a mayor's daughter, the defense lawyer said in his opening. He saw a potential killer, and in that moment, he chose to go home to his family. The trial stretched into its second week. The city watched, argued, and waited. Then the prosecutor stood and said, "The state calls Amelia Vance to the stand." A murmur went through the courtroom. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Amelia stood, smoothed her dress, and walked to the witness stand. She seemed very young and very pale. She took the oath, her voice barely a whisper. The prosecutor approached, her manner gentle. "Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that night?" Amelia took a deep breath. She described going to see a friend. The rain, realizing too late the light was red. The flash of police lights. Her nervousness. "I was just trying to get my registration," she said. "When I turned, I heard him yell. And then I saw the gun." "Where was the gun pointed?" The prosecutor asked softly. "At my face," Amelia said, her eyes glistening. "Through the window. He was so close. I could see everything. The hole at the end. His fingers. His eyes. What did you think in that moment?" "I thought I was going to die," she said, a single tear tracing down her cheek. "I wasn't thinking about my dad. I wasn't thinking about what I did wrong. I just thought, this is it. This is how it ends." For a red light. The courtroom was utterly silent. The prosecutor let that hang in the air for a moment. "You mentioned your father. Did you tell Officer Dalton who your father was?" "Not until the very end. I said it because I was desperate. I thought maybe if he knew, he would stop." "And did he?" "He lowered the gun. Then he told me to get out of the car. But the way he looked at me changed. He looked scared, not of me, of what he had done." The defense lawyer's cross-examination was tense. He tried to suggest she had moved too quickly, too furtively. "Isn't it true, Miss Vance, that you were leaning away from the officer, your right side hidden, in a car he couldn't fully see into?" "I was getting my registration, like he asked," Amelia replied, her voice gaining a little strength. "But you understand, don't you, that an officer has to make quick decisions for his safety?" Amelia looked directly at the lawyer, then her gaze shifted to Dalton, who finally looked back at her. Her voice was clear and calm when she answered, and it carried to every corner of the room. "I understand being scared," she said. "But here's what I don't understand. When he pointed that gun at me, I wasn't scared because I'd done something wrong. I knew I ran the light. I was ready for a ticket. I was scared because I realized, in that moment, the badge and the gun weren't there to protect me. They were a weapon turned against me. And all I could think later, when I stopped shaking, was, if this happens to me, with my family, what happens to people who don't have what I have? Her question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. It wasn't about the law anymore. It was about something deeper. Trust, fear, and the terrible power one person can hold over another. The defense lawyer had no more questions. The closing arguments were a final clash of worlds. The defense painted Dalton as a flawed but dedicated public servant, sacrificed on the altar of politics. Don't let a tragic misunderstanding destroy a man's life for doing a job you'd never dare to do. He pleaded. The prosecutor walked slowly in front of the jury box, her eyes locking with each juror's. This was not a misunderstanding, she said firmly. This was a choice fueled by bias and a habit of aggression. He saw a young woman in an expensive car and made a story in his head about privilege and disrespect. He acted on that story. He terrorized an innocent person. The badge is not a license for that. It's a promise to protect, to serve, and yes, to be held to a higher standard. He broke that promise. Hold him accountable. The jury filed out to deliberate. Dalton sat in a holding room with his wife, who clutched his hand, her knuckles white. He said nothing. He kept seeing Amelia Vance's face on the stand, not terrified, but sad, profoundly sad. It was worse than anger. Amelia went home with her parents. The house was quiet. The waiting was agony. For 2 days, the city waited with them. The crowds outside the courthouse dwindled, but didn't disappear. News vans kept their satellite dishes raised. On the afternoon of the third day, a note was passed to the judge. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled again, the air electric with tension. The jury entered, their faces unreadable. Dalton stood, his legs feeling like wood. The clerk took the paper. On the count of felony assault in the second degree. How do you find? Guilty. A gasp went up from the police union side. Dalton's wife let out a small cry. On the count of official misconduct. How do you find? Guilty. The words landed on Dalton like physical blows. He swayed slightly, his lawyer's hand on his arm the only thing keeping him upright. He looked at the jury, his eyes wide with disbelief, then with a dawning, terrible understanding. They hadn't believed him. They had believed the video. They had believed Amelia. As the judge set a date for sentencing, and officers moved to lead Dalton away, his mask finally crumbled. The hard, defensive stare was gone, replaced by the lost, confused look of a man who had just seen his entire life collapse. He was a convicted felon. The world he knew was over. Across the room, Amelia let out a long, shaky breath she didn't know she'd been holding. There was no victory in her heart, only a deep, hollow exhaustion and the weight of the question she had asked, which still echoed in the now silent room. The month between the verdict and the sentencing felt like a strange, tense pause for the whole city. For Rick Dalton, it was a slow unraveling. He was free on bail, but he was trapped. He spent his days in the small, quiet house that now felt like a cage. The neighbors didn't wave anymore. Reporters camped out at the end of the driveway for a week before finally losing interest. His old life, the precinct, the guys, the routine was gone, replaced by a crushing silence and the looming shadow of prison. His wife went to work each day, her own smile strained, fielding whispers from her coworkers. They had talked late into the night, in circles. He still insisted it was a setup, a political hit job. But sometimes, in the dark, he would see the dashcam footage in his mind, not from his own perspective, but from outside the car. He would see himself, a rain-soaked figure, pointing a gun at a terrified young woman. A cold shame would wash over him, so sharp it took his breath away. He would push it away just as quickly. If he let that feeling in, he would drown. The sentencing hearing was not like the trial. The drama was gone. This was about consequences. The courtroom was again full, but the mood was different. It was somber, heavy. Dalton sat at the defense table, wearing another one of his stiff suits. He looked smaller, as if the guilty verdict had physically shrunk him. His eyes were fixed on the grain of the wooden table before him. The judge, a stern older man with a reputation for being no-nonsense, entered. He had read the pre-sentencing reports, the letters of support for Dalton from a few fellow officers, and the victim impact statements. His face gave nothing away. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the state recommends a sentence of 3 to 5 years. This was a gross abuse of power. A badge is not a shield against felony conduct. A significant sentence is necessary to restore public trust and send a message that no one is above the law." Dalton's lawyer stood next. His voice was softer, pleading. "Your Honor, my client has already been punished. He's lost his career, his pension, his reputation. He has no prior criminal record. He served this city for 15 years, often in difficult and dangerous situations. This was a single terrible mistake made in a high-stress moment. We ask for probation, or at most, a county jail sentence. Prison is for violent criminals, not for a former officer who will be in immense danger inside." Then the judge turned to the side of the room. "The court will now hear victim impact statements." Amelia Vance did not stand. Instead, the first person to approach the podium was a woman in her 40s, a teacher from the east side of the city. Her hands trembled as she held a piece of paper. "Your Honor," she began, her voice thick. "My son was 16. He was walking home from basketball practice. Officer Dalton stopped him, said he fit the description of a suspect. He threw him against a wall, handcuffed him so tight his wrists bled, and kept his knee in his back for 10 minutes while he called it in. My boy wasn't a suspect. He was just a kid. He cried in my arms that night. He's never been the same. He's afraid of police now. When I saw what happened to the mayor's daughter, I cried too. Not for her, but because finally, someone with a voice might understand what he's done to so many of us." One by one, they came forward. A shopkeeper who said Dalton had bullied him for years. A young man who described being pulled over and called names, while Dalton dismantled his car, looking for drugs that weren't there. Their stories were different, but the theme was the same: fear, humiliation, a feeling of being powerless against a man in uniform who seemed to enjoy his power a little too much. Each story was a hammer blow to Dalton's narrative of himself. He kept his head down, his ears burning. These people? He remembered some of the stops, vague outlines. He'd told himself they were just doing their part, weeding out the bad ones. Hearing their pain, raw and years old, made his stomach twist. Finally, Amelia Vance stood. She walked to the podium. She looked at the judge, then at Dalton. Her face was calm, but her eyes were serious. "Your Honor," she said, "I've heard these stories over the last few weeks. It's been the hardest part of all of this, because I realize my case. It wasn't special. It was just the one that got seen. What happened to me was a symptom of something bigger, a disease of mistrust and bias." She turned her body slightly to face Dalton directly. He had no choice but to look up and meet her gaze. "Officer Dalton," she said, and her voice didn't shake. "For a long time I hated you. I had nightmares about your face. But sitting here today, I don't feel hate anymore. I feel pity and sadness. Because you were supposed to be one of the good guys. You were supposed to help. And instead, you chose to see the worst in people. You chose fear. And now, because of those choices, you've lost everything. That's your punishment. My family didn't do that to you. The jury didn't do that to you. You did. She turned back to the judge. I don't know what the right sentence is, but I hope whatever it is, it makes the next officer think twice before they let their anger and their bias pull the trigger, even if it's just pointed at someone's heart. Thank you. She returned to her seat. The room was silent, absorbing her words. They carried a moral weight that the legal arguments did not. The judge asked Dalton if he wished to make a statement. He stood up slowly. He cleared his throat. The speech his lawyer had helped him prepare was in his pocket. It talked about regret, about the difficulties of police work. But the words felt like ash in his mouth. He looked at the faces of the people who had spoken. He looked at Amelia. I'm sorry, he said, the words coming out rough and unconvincing. I followed my training. I thought there was a threat. I'm sorry for the distress. It was a cop's apology, defensive, impersonal. It accepted no real responsibility. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. After a long moment, the judge put on his glasses and began to speak. His voice was calm, measured, and filled the quiet room. This case has laid bare a painful divide in our community, he began. It has shown us the devastating impact when those sworn to protect us violate that sacred trust. The court has considered the defendant's years of service, but it has also considered the years of complaints, the pattern of behavior that this incident was not an anomaly from, but a part of. He looked directly at Dalton. Officer Dalton, you did not just make a mistake. You exercised your vast authority with a reckless and biased disregard for the life and dignity of another human being. You saw a young woman and you saw a threat, not because of her actions, but because of a story you told yourself. You turned the instrument of your office of firearm into a tool of terror. The damage you have done extends far beyond one victim. It erodes the very foundation of civic trust. For that, there must be a significant consequence. He took a breath. On the count of felony assault in the second degree, this court sentences you to 2 years in a state correctional facility. On the count of official misconduct, 2 years, to be served concurrently. You are remanded to custody immediately. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. There was a collective exhale in the room. 2 years. Not the maximum, but real prison time. Not county jail. Dalton's wife let out a soft sob. Dalton himself seemed to deflate, all the fight finally gone. He looked blank, as if he couldn't process the words. 2 uniformed court officers stepped forward, took him gently by the arms, and led him through a side door. He did not look back. Outside the courthouse, the reactions exploded. Police union leaders called the sentence a travesty and a surrender to mob politics. They talked about an officer thrown under the bus. Community activists held a quiet vigil, saying the sentence was a start, but only a start. Now we need to change the system that created him, one leader told the cameras. Amelia and her parents left through a back entrance, avoiding the crowds. Reporters shouted questions she couldn't hear. In the quiet of the car, her father squeezed her hand. It's over, he said, his voice tired. But Amelia looked out the window at the city passing by. She saw a patrol car driving down a side street. She saw 2 officers talking to a man on a corner. It didn't feel over. It felt like a door had been opened onto a room full of pain she never knew existed, and she didn't know how to close it. The man who had pointed a gun at her was going to prison, but the feeling he had given her that deep, cold fear that was still out there, in the rain on other streets, for other people, and she didn't know what to do about that. Time didn't stop after the sentencing. It moved forward, carrying everyone into a new, uncertain reality. For Rick Dalton, the 2-year sentence became 18 months with good behavior. Those 18 months were a life erased. The state prison was a world of concrete and noise, a constant, humiliating reversal of roles. He was no longer the one with the keys and the authority. He was a number, a face in a line, and his past as a cop made him a target. He spent his time in protective custody, a form of solitary meant to keep him safe from the general population. The isolation was its own kind of punishment. He had nothing to do but think, and his thoughts were a dark, looping track of resentment and self-pity. He replayed the trial, the faces of the people who spoke against him, Amelia Vance's calm, pitying stare. He clung to his story. He was a good cop, sacrificed. It was the only thing that kept him from crumbling dot when the gates finally clanged shut behind him. He was a ghost of his former self. Thinner, quieter, his eyes permanently wary. His wife had stuck by him, but their marriage was a strained, quiet thing. The old friends from the force had mostly faded away. The world outside was loud and bright and confusing. He was a convicted felon. No gun, no badge, no career. He found a job as a night security guard in a nearly empty warehouse, a bitter echo of his old life. He moved through his days in a gray haze, a man permanently stuck in the past, believing the world had wronged him. The system had used him and thrown him away. He never truly understood the pain he had caused. He only understood his own. Across the city, Amelia Vance was on a different path. The hollow exhaustion after the trial didn't last. It was replaced by a restless energy. She couldn't just go back to her old life. The question she had asked in court, what happens to people who don't have what I have, wouldn't leave her alone. She started to read, to attend community meetings with her father, listening more than she spoke. She heard stories that mirrored hers, but without the cameras, without the political pressure. Stories that ended with shrugged shoulders and closed case files. She used the one thing she had, her platform. Quietly at first, then with more confidence, she began to advocate. She didn't scream or accuse. She simply told her story, over and over, and then she listened to the stories of others. She teamed up with city council members to push for a serious independent civilian review board for the police department, one with real power to investigate complaints. She became a constant, polite presence at budget meetings, arguing for more funding for body cameras for every officer and for the unedited footage to be available. She championed mandatory, ongoing de-escalation training for the entire force. It was an uphill battle. The police union fought her at every turn, calling her a naive radical riding her father's coattails. She received nasty emails, social media taunts. But she also received letters from mothers, from teenagers, from ordinary people thanking her for speaking up. Her father, the mayor, initially wanted to protect her, to make it all go away. But seeing her determination, he changed. He made police accountability a central part of his administration. It cost him political allies, but he didn't back down. One afternoon, nearly 3 years after the traffic stop, Amelia stood before a crowded city council chamber. The vote on the new review board was finally happening. She wasn't there to testify. She was just there to watch. An older councilwoman, a longtime ally of the police union, gave a fiery speech about demonizing hardworking officers. Then a younger councilman stood up. He held up a sheaf of papers. "This isn't about demonizing anyone," he said, his voice steady. "This is about trust. It's about what happened to a young woman named Amelia Vance, and to countless others whose names we don't know. It's about making sure the system works for everyone, not just for the people with power or for the people in uniform. It's about fixing what's broken before it breaks us all." The vote was called. It passed by a single vote. It was a small victory, just a piece of paper. But in the hallway afterward, a woman Amelia didn't know, a black woman in a nurse's scrubs, stopped her. She took Amelia's hand, her eyes full of tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice fierce. "My boy." He needs to know the system can see him, too. In that moment, Amelia felt the hollowness finally begin to fill. This was the answer. Not forgetting, but building something better. The changes in the police department were slow, and they met constant resistance. But they happened. The new training sessions were rolled out. Officers grumbled about them, called them a waste of time. But some, especially the younger ones, listened. Officer Luis, Dalton's old partner, now a sergeant, made a point of teaching the de-escalation modules himself. He used what happened that rainy night as a private, painful lesson in what not to do. He never mentioned names, but the story was understood. The city didn't magically heal. The divide was still there. But a new conversation had started, one that was harder to ignore. It was no longer just about cops versus civilians. It was about procedure, about bias, about the immense responsibility that comes with a badge and a gun. Years later, on a sunny, ordinary day, their paths almost crossed again. Amelia was leaving a downtown shop, a binder full of proposals for a youth outreach program under her arm. A man in a warm jacket was walking in, head down, eyes on the pavement. It was Rick Dalton. He looked up as he held the door. Their eyes met. A flood of memories hit them both: the rain, the gun, the courtroom. For a second, the noise of the street faded. Dalton's face showed no recognition at first, then a slow, dawning awareness. He saw a confident, purposeful young woman, not the terrified girl from his car window. He saw someone who had moved on, who had built something from the wreckage he caused. There was no hatred in her eyes now, just a calm, steady acknowledgement. Then, a faint, sad flicker of that same pity he remembered from the stand. Amelia saw an older man, worn down by life, haunted by his own choices. The anger he once carried seemed to have collapsed inward, leaving only a deep emptiness. He was a ghost, and she was fully, vibrantly alive. He quickly looked away, his shoulders hunching slightly. He mumbled a faint, "Sorry," though it was unclear if it was for holding the door or for everything else. He shuffled inside, disappearing into the dimness of the shop. Amelia stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the sun warm on her face. She took a deep breath. The past had brushed against her, but it didn't grab her. It had no power anymore. She turned and walked down the busy street toward her future. Back in the coffee shop, Dalton stood in line, staring at the menu board without seeing it. That brief glance had shattered the story he told himself. She wasn't destroyed. She was stronger. The system hadn't been ruined by his case. It had, in its clumsy, painful way, adapted. He was the only one who had been left behind, frozen in that moment on the rainy street, forever the man pointing the gun. He got his coffee and sat alone at a small table. He was just another man with a past, invisible in the city he once patrolled. The badge was gone. The gun was gone. All that was left was the consequence, and the long, quiet stretch of a life defined by a single, terrible choice. The incident became a case study, a footnote in the city's history. For some, it was a story about a bad apple finally being plucked. For others, it was a story about a system that only worked when the victim was the right kind of person. For Amelia, it became the reason she woke up in the morning. For Dalton, it became the tombstone of the man he thought he was. The rain that night had washed away the old certainties for everyone. What grew back was different, more fragile, more complicated, and for some, more hopeful. It was never really about one officer or one traffic stop. It was about the stories we tell ourselves about each other and the devastating cost we pay when those stories are wrong.